I grew up believing my grandparents were my parents and my biological mother was my sister, a secret kept to protect me and my mother. When I turned 18, I discovered the truth, and my family finally came clean, and I built a relationship with my biologic mother. Growing up, my family always felt a little off, but I never had a clear reason why. We lived in a small house on the edge of town, where everyone knew everyone else's business. My parents were older compared to most of the moms and dads at school, but I just assumed they'd had me late in life. My sister, Emily, was only 16 years older than me, which sometimes felt more like an aunt-niece dynamic than a sibling relationship. She never really acted like a big sister though, more like a shadow in the background, someone whose approval I didn't particularly seek and who didn't go out of her way to get involved in my life. As a kid, you take your family structure as it's given. You don't think to question it. But as I got older, there were cracks in the narrative. Little comments from neighbors. Odd silences when certain subjects came up. Once, at age 13, I overheard a woman from down the street saying to her friend, "It's such a shame they had to lie to her." I didn't understand what that meant, and when I asked my mom about it, she brushed it off with a distracted, "People love to gossip, don't listen to them." My teenage years were already turbulent, school drama, friendships ending, my first breakup. I was navigating the emotional minefield that comes with being 16 and feeling like no one really understood me. Emily, still living at home at that point, didn't help. She was cold, distant, and seemed to resent me for reasons I couldn't place. But the biggest weight pressing on me wasn't any of that. It was the feeling that something about my life didn't quite add up. I didn't have the vocabulary for it at the time, but looking back, I realized it was the constant hum of unspoken truths in the air, lingering in the pauses of conversations and in the way certain questions were deflected. I just didn't know how deep those truths ran, not yet. When I turned 18, I thought the biggest change in my life would be finally moving out, starting college, and maybe getting some distance from the suffocating small-town bubble. I didn't expect my entire identity to crack open overnight. It started with a box. A plain cardboard box shoved to the back of the closet in the guest room. I was packing up old books to donate when I found it. It wasn't marked, but the tape holding it closed was brittle with age. Inside, there were stacks of old photographs, most of which I recognized: family gatherings, birthdays, trips to the lake. But as I dug deeper, I found hospital bracelets, a birth certificate, and a few handwritten letters. That's when the puzzle pieces started rearranging themselves in my head. The birth certificate had my name, my birth date, but where it listed mother, it didn't have my mom's name. It had Emily's. At first, I told myself it had to be a mistake. Some kind of clerical error. I tried to shove the papers back into the box, but my hands were trembling. The letters were worse. They were from social workers and doctors, discussing arrangements for guardianship and protecting the child from instability. One even mentioned that Emily was too young to raise a baby on her own. The room felt like it was closing in on me. My parents, no, my grandparents, had kept this from me for my entire life. Emily wasn't my sister. She was my mother. The knowledge burned in my chest, an aching, twisting feeling that was half betrayal, half disorientation. All those years of feeling like I didn't quite belong, of wondering why Emily looked at me with a strange mix of guilt and distance, they suddenly made sense. But knowing the truth didn't bring relief. It felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me. After that day, everything about my life shifted. The house, the people I thought I knew, the memories I held. All seemed like a fragile illusion. I wanted to scream, to demand answers, but the fear of what I might hear kept me silent. Instead, I started piecing together what little I could from those letters and the few conversations I could overhear when no one realized I was listening. My biological mother, Emily, had me when she was barely a teenager. Her parents, my grandparents, stepped in immediately. They were determined to protect both Emily and me from the harsh judgment of our small town. So, they raised me as their own daughter, telling me that Emily was my older sister. It was their way of hiding the truth, but it was also a way to keep me safe. Yet, safety felt like a prison. I realized why Emily never embraced me as a sister. She was a mother who had been forced into silence. And why my parents were so controlling and watchful. They carried the weight of a secret they thought was for my own good. But the more I understood, the more trapped I felt in a web of lies I had lived my entire life. I tried to keep it together, going to school, seeing friends, but every smile felt fake. I wasn't just a teenager dealing with typical struggles anymore. I was a kid caught in a complicated family drama that no one wanted to talk about. I felt isolated, like I was alone in a world where everyone else had clear roots and stories to hold on to. It took months before I dared to confront Emily. Not with anger, but with questions, desperate for her to explain what had happened, why she had to give me up, and what it meant for us now. When my father came into the picture, everything shifted again, but in a way I hadn't expected. After years of silence and mystery, he appeared quietly, almost shyly, like he didn't want to disrupt what we'd started to build. He wasn't the rough, distant stranger I'd imagined. Instead, he was kind and gentle, someone who seemed genuinely interested in getting to know me without rushing or demanding anything. It was strange, this new connection after so much absence, but it brought a sense of calm I hadn't realized I needed. Emily's reaction was complicated. Part of her seemed relieved to finally have him around, to fill in pieces of the puzzle that had been missing for so long. But there was also hesitation, the kind of hesitation that comes from years of pain and mistrust. As for me, I was caught somewhere between curiosity and caution. I wanted to believe that he could be a positive presence, but years of not knowing made me wary of expecting too much. Still, with his arrival, our small, fragile family took on a new shape. It wasn't perfect and it wasn't easy, but it was a new chapter, one filled with possibilities we hadn't dared to imagine before. At first, having Dad around felt like a breath of fresh air, a missing piece of the puzzle finally showing up. But as time passed, the cracks started to show. The past didn't just vanish with his arrival. Instead, old wounds reopened and new tensions bubbled to the surface. Mom, Emily, was cautious but also guarded. Though she wanted to believe things could be different, the history between her and Dad was complicated. Unspoken resentments simmered beneath the surface, and small arguments flared into bigger conflicts. I found myself caught in the middle, trying to understand two people I loved but who clearly had unresolved pain between them. It felt like walking on a tightrope, constantly balancing loyalty and self-protection. Dad was kind, yes, but the drama between him and Emily strained the fragile trust we'd started to build. It was hard not to wonder if bringing him into our lives was a step forward or a step backward. Every conversation seemed to carry an undercurrent of tension, and the warmth that had begun to grow between us sometimes felt overshadowed by the ghosts of the past. The arguments between Emily and Dad weren't always loud, but their silence spoke volumes. When they did speak, it often felt like they were revisiting old mistakes neither wanted to face head-on. Emily's protective walls went up, and Dad's attempts to bridge the gap were met with guarded responses. I felt torn. On one hand, I wanted my parents to find peace and build something stable. On the other, I was afraid their history might pull us all apart before we even had a chance. It was exhausting, watching the people who had shaped my life wrestle with their past, and it made me question what family really meant. Was it the people who raised you? The ones who gave you life? Or was it something more complicated, a fragile web of love, mistakes, and second chances? In the midst of this chaos, I clung to the small moments when things felt right. When Emily smiled without the weight of secrets, or when Dad's kindness shone through despite everything. Those moments were rare but precious, reminders that even broken families can find a way forward, even if the path is anything but smooth. After that day, everything about my life shifted. The house, the people I thought I knew, the memories I held. All seemed like a fragile illusion. I wanted to scream, to demand answers, but the fear of what I might hear kept me silent. Instead, I started piecing together what little I could from those letters and the few conversations I could overhear when no one realized I was listening. My biological mother, Emily, had me when she was barely a teenager. Her parents, my grandparents, stepped in immediately. They were determined to protect both Emily and me from the harsh judgment of our small town. So, they raised me as their own daughter, telling me that Emily was my older sister. It was their way of hiding the truth, but it was also a way to keep me safe. Yet, safety felt like a prison. I realized why Emily never embraced me as a sister. She was a mother who had been forced into silence. And why my parents were so controlling and watchful. They carried the weight of a secret they thought was for my own good. But the more I understood, the more trapped I felt in a web of lies I had lived my entire life. I tried to keep it together, going to school, seeing friends, but every smile felt fake. I wasn't just a teenager dealing with typical struggles anymore. I was a kid caught in a complicated family drama that no one wanted to talk about. I felt isolated, like I was alone in a world where everyone else had clear roots and stories to hold on to. It took months before I dared to confront Emily. Not with anger, but with questions, desperate for her to explain what had happened, why she had to give me up, and what it meant for us now. It was in the quiet kitchen one evening, the kind of still moment where all the tension seemed to hang in the air. She didn't deny anything. Instead, she looked exhausted, like she had been carrying the weight of the secret for years and was just waiting for the day it would come crashing down. She told me about how scared she had been at 16, how the town was cruel and unforgiving, and how her parents had insisted on raising me themselves. She said it was supposed to protect me from the gossip, from the shame they feared I'd face if everyone knew the truth. But mostly, she said she wished things could have been different, that she could have been the mother I deserved instead of the sister I was told to pretend she was. Her words didn't fix the broken pieces inside me, but they did fill in some blanks. I realized that none of us were villains in this story. We were just people trying to survive the circumstances we were given, trying to protect one another in the only way we knew how. Still, the knowledge didn't make the world feel less complicated. How do you move forward when the foundation of your life was built on half-truths? How do you trust the people who lied to you for your own good? I spent a long time wrestling with those questions. I thought about cutting ties, about walking away from the family that felt more like a carefully constructed performance than a real home. But every time I looked at Emily, I saw not a stranger, but the woman who had given me life and carried her own pain quietly beside mine. The road ahead wasn't clear. But for the first time, I was starting to see my family in a different light, flawed, broken, but real. As I began to process the truth about my mom and the way my grandparents raised me, another question started to grow in the back of my mind. Who was my father? Up until then, I'd never given it much thought. It made me wonder if the answer was something they didn't want me to know, or something painful they were protecting me from. I tried to piece together clues from old photos and vague comments, but it was like chasing shadows. The letters I'd found gave no hint. No name was ever mentioned, just references to the father's absence, or no known involvement. I asked Emily once, carefully, if she knew anything, but she only shook her head and told me some things were better left alone. That response only made me more curious, maybe even desperate for answers. I started looking through public records trying to find any detail about my birth, any trace of who my dad might be. But nothing concrete came up. It was like he had vanished before I was even born. I felt hollow, as if a part of me was missing. Knowing who my mother was had changed everything, but not knowing where I came from on my father's side left a void I wasn't sure how to fill. It wasn't just about biology, it was about identity, about understanding where I came from and why my life had taken such a complicated path. After finally confronting the truth, Emily and I found ourselves in unfamiliar territory. The years of complicated roles we'd been forced to play didn't just disappear. We didn't suddenly become mother and daughter overnight. Instead, we started slowly, tentative conversations, quiet moments filled with more questions than answers. Emily was hesitant at first, unsure how to bridge the gap she hadn't even realized was there until it was too wide to ignore. For her, it was about finding the courage to show up in a way she never had before. For me, it was about learning to trust someone who had kept the most important secret of my life. Our relationship was fragile, a work in progress. There were times when the weight of the past seemed too heavy to carry, and silence crept back in. But other times, there were glimmers of hope, shared laughter over small things, a touch on the arm that said, "I'm here." We both knew this was just the beginning. We were stepping into an unknown future, trying to rewrite a story that had been written without us. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time, I felt like I wasn't walking it alone. But just as we started finding a fragile rhythm, something new came into our lives, someone who would change everything again. The tension between Emily and Dad didn't just affect them, it spilled into every part of my life. Suddenly, the home that had once felt like a safe haven was a battlefield of unspoken frustrations and fragile alliances. I found myself retreating more and more, trying to make sense of my own feelings amid the chaos. Friends at school noticed I was quieter, less myself. I wanted to explain, but the truth was too complicated, too raw. Dad tried to be a steady presence, but his efforts sometimes felt like a reminder of everything we'd lost, the years of absence, the silence, the secrets. Emily's mood swings left me unsure of where I stood. One day she'd be warm and open, the next, distant and cold. I began to realize that healing wasn't a straight line. It was messy, unpredictable, and often painful. But despite everything, I wanted to believe in it. I wanted to believe that my family, however fractured, could find a way to heal. So I held on to hope. Hope that someday the past wouldn't define us. That we could learn to forgive each other and ourselves. That maybe, just maybe, we could become something stronger than the secrets that had tried to keep us apart. The tension between Emily and Dad didn't just affect them, it spilled into every part of my life. Suddenly, the home that had once felt like a safe haven was a battlefield of unspoken frustrations and fragile alliances. I found myself retreating more and more, trying to make sense of my own feelings amid the chaos. Friends at school noticed I was quieter, less myself. I wanted to explain, but the truth was too complicated, too raw. Dad tried to be a steady presence, but his efforts sometimes felt like a reminder of everything we'd lost, the years of absence, the silence, the secrets. Emily's mood swings left me unsure of where I stood. One day she'd be warm and open, the next, distant and cold. I began to realize that healing wasn't a straight line. It was messy, unpredictable, and often painful. But despite everything, I wanted to believe in it. I wanted to believe that my family, however fractured, could find a way to heal. So I held on to hope. Hope that someday the past wouldn't define us. That we could learn to forgive each other and ourselves. That maybe, just maybe, we could become something stronger than the secrets that had tried to keep us apart. Time passed, and the fragile truce between Emily and Dad remained uneasy but steady. Slowly, we learned to navigate the new dynamics, each of us adjusting to the changes in our own way. Emily started opening up more, not just to me, but to Dad as well. I saw glimpses of the woman she might have been if life hadn't forced her into silence so early. It was painful to watch, but also inspiring. She was trying, even when it was hard. Dad, too, softened with time. The kindness that had first drawn me to him didn't disappear. It grew into a steady presence that helped fill some of the gaps I'd felt for so long. He wasn't perfect, no one is, but he was genuine, and that mattered. For me, the hardest part was learning to accept this imperfect family for what it was, rather than what I wished it could be. It meant embracing the messiness, the disagreements, the moments of doubt. But it also meant celebrating the small victories, a shared meal, a genuine smile, a conversation without walls. We weren't a perfect family, and probably never would be. But we were a family, and that was enough to keep trying. As the months turned into a year, the relationships within our family slowly evolved, though the journey was far from linear. Emily and Dad still had their moments of tension, but they were learning to coexist, sometimes awkwardly, sometimes with surprising grace. Their past wasn't erased, but it was no longer an invisible barrier controlling every interaction. For me, the biggest change was in how I saw myself. The tangled web of secrets and half-truths had shaped so much of my identity, but as the pieces came together, I began to understand that my story wasn't defined by what was hidden. It was defined by resilience, by the way my family, flawed as we were, kept trying despite the odds. School felt less like an escape, and more like a part of my life where I could just be. I started opening up to a few close friends, carefully sharing parts of my story. Their support reminded me that while family is complicated, it's not the only place to find love and understanding. Still, there were days when the weight of everything felt crushing. Moments when I doubted if healing was even possible, or if some scars would just never fade. But those moments passed, because in the quiet spaces between the chaos, I found something steady, a sense of hope that maybe, someday, I could build a life that wasn't defined by secrets, but by truth and acceptance. By the time I reached my early 20s, the family I had once struggled to understand had become something more familiar, though still imperfect. I still had my grandparents who had raised me, but so much more now. The scars from years of hidden truths never fully disappeared, but they became a part of my life. Not the whole of it. Emily and Dad didn't suddenly become the ideal parents I might have dreamed of, but they both showed me something better: effort. They showed me that family isn't about perfection, but about showing up, even when it's hard, even when the past threatens to pull you back. Our dinner still had awkward silences. Arguments still flared up, but we learned to listen more and judge less. I learned to hold space for their mistakes, just as I hoped they'd hold space for mine. I had to learn through therapy and other experiences the past will always be part of me, but it doesn't control me anymore. I am learning to forgive, not just them, but myself too.